Welcome to the next episode of the Constitution Line by Line. I'm Don Frazier, professor of history at McMurray University.
I'm Paul Fabrizio, professor of history at wait a second.
I nearly sucked him in.
I teach political science at McMurray University.
So I'll provide the context and he'll provide you with all the sausage
politics.
making. Yeah, yay.
Yes.
All right, so this particular episode is about where the Constitution came from, because it wasn't always the governing document of the United States.
No, and in fact, it was really the third government that we had. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about.
So what's the first one?
Well, we need to just put it in history.
Right.
Okay, we have to start with July 4th, 1776.
Bam, we declare ourselves a country. Now what happens?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you think about that and you put that in a modern context. Let's say some group of colonies, states get together and say, hey, we're independent of everybody else.
Let's say California seceded because they didn't like the presidential election.
There you go.
Theoretically.
And they talked about that just like Texas has talked about that in previous times. So you declare independence and then you go, okay, we're free. And then when you get over your hangover, you go, what do we do now?
Yeah, now what happens?
So the first thing we had was a Continental Congress.
And it's a Continental Congress representing 13 colonies that were almost mutually exclusive to each other.
Yes.
I mean, you can even look at how the road net, the colonial road net looked.
Okay.
All the roads went from the fall line, which is, where the rivers become too shallow to navigate.
Okay.
All the way down to the coast. So most of the roads in the United States ran from the fall line to the coast. So we're talking, north to south in Connecticut, west to east in Massachusetts, west to east in Carolinas. They did not run from colony to colony. Those roads were the worst.
So there wasn't any connection together.
No. I mean, those roads were full of stumps. They were rutted, never kept up. But the roads where people were taking their products to be shipped to market, boy, those roads were pretty well maintained.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells you right now we are still looking out to sea.
Right.
As 13 colonies, and we can't really tell what we have in common, not to mention the fact that each of the colonies is founded under different circumstances.
Yes, indeed. It has a different tradition, different kind of government, different ideas about religion, for example.
Oh, Massachusetts versus Georgia? Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
Pennsylvania full of weirdos and free thinkers and Quakers.
Weirdos.
Yeah, weirdos.
So what they had in common was one thing, and that was a dislike, even hatred, of the British government.
But they hated it to lesser and greater degrees as well.
There you go.
Like they say about every revolution, 20% of the people are patriots, 20% of the people are Tories, and 60% just want to be left alone.
That's right.
So much of any sort of political movement is convincing that 60%.
Yeah, so when you have that kind of atmosphere, basically what they did is they sent representatives, each of the states sent representatives to a Congress, and they didn't have any documents to agree to give them goals, didn't have any high ideals.
Like
it was
book
just
club.
It was just like, we're going to get together and discuss things, but we've got an army and we're fighting a war
against what would probably be a superpower for its age.
Yeah, exactly. And George Washington was head of that army.
Yes.
And he needed help from the government, money, arms.
From this PTA group that was gathering.
And like any other PTA group, it had problems getting organized.
Oh, yeah.
And they weren't sure of their mission. They had problems collecting dues from members.
Yep.
And so George Washington and his forces were largely left alone, except the Continental Congress would complain.
Oh, yeah. They always had an opinion about things.
Yeah, but they didn't want to help.
Yeah, correct. And they're out there twisting in the wind at places like Valley Forge and Morristown.
They were starving.
Yeah.
They had no food.
And the French want to throw in, but they're not sure who to throw in with or to.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was our first attempt at government. Yes, indeed.
What a nightmare.
How did we survive?
I haven't a clue. Some would claim it was Providence.
There you go. And keep that thought in mind.
Okay. And also, I think that George Washington had a large role to play.
Yes.
He was the indispensable man. He very easily could have turned this into a military dictatorship.
Very easily.
And a lot of his officers argued that that's what needed to happen. Said, overthrow Congress. Those guys are knuckleheads, and you just be King George the First of America,
Yes.
and we'll build our own country with a strong man at the helm. And he refused to do it. The Nuremberg conspiracy is really where this all came to a head. And by that time, the British had pretty much decided that they couldn't win militarily.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they were sitting back thinking, fine, we'll win politically and economically, but we won't win militarily. So we'll let them have their independence and then watch them fall apart.
Yeah.
And so people said, look, the British are kind of taking their foot off the gas pedal. So why don't you, George, take over and whip us into shape?
And George refused to do it.
He refused to do it. And one of the most stirring events in the entire episode of the American Revolution to me is when he is addressing his officers at Newburgh,
Mm-hmm.
and he is talking about, kind of what needs to happen. And as he gets his address on the podium, he reaches into his pocket for his glasses. Puts them
Okay.
on, and he says, I apologize, gentlemen, but not only have I grown old in the service of my country, I've also lost my eyesight. And so he's saying, look, knuckleheads, we've all sacrificed. We're all a little put out with Congress and their ineptitude, but we're fighting for something larger here.
Right.
And I think that was a turning point in human events.
Yeah. And the question was, what were they fighting for that was larger?
Yeah, correct.
And maybe this goes back to what you talked about earlier, virtue.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I talked about these guys running a book club.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, they were. All right, so there's a number of books that are living inside of everybody's head in 1776. One is the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they were religious,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not they believed anything in it, whether or not they were Thomas Jefferson and clipping out whole passages that they found
I don't
objectionable.
like this
Yeah,
part.
I don't like this part, don't like this part. It didn't matter because the Judeo-Christian Western civilization ethic inhabited their mental space.
Yes.
And they're also, by and large, products of a classical education, we'd call it today. These guys were learning things like Latin and Greek, and they were reading classical literature, sometimes in the original language. So they're reading Plato's Republic.
Mm-hmm.
They're reading Roman philosophers. They're reading people that said, look, here's how you set up a republic. And a republic can only be kept by a virtuous citizenry.
Right.
And that's what they're bringing to the table. And they're dreamers. And they're young.
Mm-hmm.
These guys
They're
are
very young.
Yeah, 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And they said, look, if we're going to do this thing, let's experiment with something ideal. And so they're fighting for ideals.
Okay. Now, before we get too far into that, however,
Yes,
they created a second form of government,
they did.
the Articles of Confederation.
They knew they needed some rules.
That's right. So they realized the Continental Congress was an abject failure.
Yeah.
So they said, what can we do? So they created the Articles of Confederation. So in essence, an agreement that we're all in this together.
Yes.
And that's about all we agreed to, but we're in it together. Now, the way I describe a confederation, because a federation will be in the Constitution,
Correct.
but a confederation, the people give the power to the states.
Correct.
And the states then, if they want to, can give power to a national government.
Correct.
But the states come first. And so what we've got with the Articles of Confederation is an agreement that the people are giving power to the states, and the states are going to get together in a legislative sense, and they're going to give a few powers very grudgingly to the national government.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it if you're Rhode Island.
Right.
I mean, you're not even as large as Brewster County, Texas. I mean, so you're a little chunk of dirt that is sort of a knockoff Massachusetts and sort of Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you maintain your identity and your relevance in the middle of this new country? So you're going to be very jealous of all of your rights that you have just earned by sending your husbands and sons off to fight. So getting anybody to agree on anything is going to be challenging. Take Virginia. That's where all the people are.
Please take it.
Yeah, please take it. That's where the people are. That's where the money is. These guys think that they should have an outsized role in how this new nation should be run.
Right.
And so that brings with it an entire basket of issues.
It does. So what we've got is states jealously guarding their prerogatives.
Yes.
States jockeying for powers.
States that are not in the habit of cooperating with each other to begin with.
Right. And they're all in there in this government. And in the Articles of Confederation, they really didn't give to the national government the power to tax.
Nope.
And they didn't give the power to raise an army
No.
to the national government. So really, what was the national government for?
Yeah, what would you say you do here? And they couldn't enforce even things like the Treaty of Paris.
Right.
So the revolution ends. The United States,
Yay,
we win. The British very obligingly give the western boundary of the United States as the Mississippi, which is a lot more real estate than really was warranted.
Right.
But the British were playing the long game. They figured, well, we'll let these Americans hold it for us until they collapse.
Which won't be long.
Which won't be long, and we'll scoop it up after that. But this automatically puts them at odds with the Spanish and, to a lesser degree, the French, who had just helped them win this revolution. And the Americans are very quick to abandon their former allies. So the former allies say, fine. Well,
they really said fine.
No, they said
fine.
Está bien, because they said we are not going to let you transit the Mississippi. So this may be your western boundary, but you're not going to get any benefit from it. In fact, the Spanish launch an 11-ship flotilla of galleys and even a couple of river frigates to patrol it, because they didn't like all those American illegal aliens crossing the river into their territory. And then we're going to let them use the Mississippi as any sort of commercial corridor. Well, the British said, as part of the Treaty of Paris, you need to compensate all the property that was seized from loyalists.
Okay.
So if you're a Tory, the revolutionaries, the patriots, came in and seized your farm, seized your property. And so the British are saying, all right, now we're all friends again. You need to compensate these people that you ripped off. And the United States says, absolutely. And then the states said, except in South Carolina, except in Virginia, except in Massachusetts. And they just didn't enforce it.
Right.
And so the British said, fine. Remember all that territory we gave you all the way to the Mississippi River? We're just going to fail to leave. And we're just going to continue garrisoning the forts out here in the wilderness until you guys comply.
And what are you guys going to be able to do about it?
Yeah.
And under the Articles of Confederation, nothing.
And not only could they not do anything about the continued British presence on the frontier, or the Spanish being knuckleheads on the Mississippi, and in their defense, they were playing a correct game for them. The Articles of Confederation government wouldn't even allow the states to comply if they wanted to. I mean, it was just, they were at loggerheads. So you got to break this thing and you got to fix it.
And they realized this, the members of the legislature, the American legislature at that time under the Articles, and they said, this is not working.
This ain't working.
And they started to realize that the states cannot be the dominant form of government.
Wasn't working.
And so what they created, instead of a confederation, was a federation. And in a federation, the people give power to the national government and to the states.
Yeah.
So power goes to both of them directly, rather than power going to one and them grudgingly giving it to the other.
Correct. And I've always heard that Shays's rebellion in Massachusetts was kind of one of the turning points in his thinking. Primarily because there's a full-blown rebellion to authority in the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts asked for some sort of help.
Help.
You know, these guys,
being attacked.
We're being attacked by the very people that won the revolution.
And we can't afford to do anything about it ourselves.
Well, and Massachusetts was treating them very unfairly, in my opinion. And Daniel Shays had a legitimate argument. But it was scary.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden you could have these sort of local rebellions that would affect the overall country,
Hmm.
but the overall country had no way to affect these rebellions. And Washington said, all right, I need to come back out of retirement and I need to help provide some leadership and guide the country towards the next phase. But what he was suggesting and what everybody was agreeing to was forming a new government that was extra legal. How do you,
Shocking.
I know, how do you kind of hey, we need to overthrow our own government, which means I have to overthrow myself. I mean, the way we're doing it now just doesn't work. So the Constitution is a strange sort of event where a government essentially allows itself to be overthrown.
Right.
And
which I would argue is an incredible act of maturity
huge
on the part of the people, an incredible act of acknowledgement of their own failure.
Yes.
And what it led to then in the summer of 1787 was the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah. So the U.S. Constitution then becomes what we'll be talking about in this entire
this marathon
discussion of the Constitution line by line. But I think it helps to have this context to know that, this didn't come down on angels' wings one day. This was a process, and it was a long and grinding process.
And it took place within 11 years. 1776 to 1787, 3 forms of government.
Yeah.
A war, a revolutionary war, a rebellion, Shays' Rebellion,
yeah,
all in 11 years. It's unbelievable.
It's an action-packed 11 years.
It is. And, if that were to happen today, we would look at that country and go, what a mess.
What are y'all, Venezuela?
Yeah, stay away from them.
All right, so I think I'll let you have the last word on this episode, and then what we're going to do in the next is talk about the preamble. I guess the last question I have for the context on how this came about is, how long was the Constitutional Convention? Where was it held? I mean, what are those?
It was in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia.
Yikes.
And in the middle of it, there was an outbreak of dysentery. And it was a very hot summer.
Yes.
And they didn't want people listening in to their conversations. So it was the equivalent of being sworn to secrecy on the part of them. Wow. Because remember, they're trying to overthrow their government.
Correct.
And so there's a lot of curiosity. What are these guys doing? But the framers needed time to talk among themselves without all this outside pressure.
Oh, could you imagine if something was leaked and then it went in the press and people were essentially...
they're considering 2 legislative branches. Or, they're going to have a presidency, and they might call him a king,
And they're essentially, grinding every line by line as it's written. God, yeah. We'd have never gotten anything done.
Exactly.
So were there notes kept?
There was, how do you describe it? There were arguments. Okay. The Federalist Papers.
Okay.
Which were used on the basis of notes that were taken during the actual convention as a way to sell the Constitution to the states, which then had to ratify it.
So there weren't any minutes to this meeting?
There were no minutes.
Interesting. So this is a secret double handshake, nudge, nudge, wink, wink gathering.
In a hot room.
With people having to get up and go to the bathroom frequently.
Yes. Can you imagine? Yeah, I mean, it would just be horrible.
Now, what was the line that is attributed to Franklin after the...
After it was over, a woman approached him and said, "What have you given us?" And he said, "We've given you a republic, if you can keep it."
And that's why we're doing this show.
That's right, because we want to keep this republic.
We want to keep this republic. All right, so in the next episode, we will take you through the preamble to the United States Constitution, a bit of prose that many school children through time have been forced to memorize. We'll be right back with the next episode. Thanks.